Hello and welcome to Red Pill Rundown. I recently finished reading Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe. Would you like to learn more about physical removal? No worries, because here's your quick rundown on Democracy, the God That Failed, the economics and politics of monarchy, democracy, and natural order. Just a quick note on the video that this is going to have a bit of a different format than usual. I read this book over just a couple of days instead of weeks as I normally do. So instead I'm just going to look at the table of contents and summarize off the top of my head, chapter by chapter, while it's still fresh in my head. So with that, we're going to start with Chapter 1, on time preference, government, and the process of decivilization. So what Hoppe is talking about here, first and foremost, to set us up for the rest of the book, is time preference being how much someone or a group of people are present-oriented versus future-oriented. So you could have a group of people that live in an area that's filled with natural resources. They don't really need to plan ahead. They can get what they need to live and survive day by day, versus a group where, say, like in Northern Europe or Northern Asia, where you have winter, you need to plan ahead. So you actually have to have the foresight there and what he would call a lower time preference rate to forego satisfaction immediately in order to get a greater satisfaction in the future. So you could take farming as another example of that. You're foregoing eating the seeds, but instead planting them to get something even more valuable in the future, just with a bit of patience and preparation. So government, he is talking about here monarchy versus democracy specifically. He makes some comparisons with how prior to World War I and especially World War II, monarchy, particularly a hereditary monarchy, was the go-to form of government in most of Western Europe, and you really only had a couple democracies, particularly the United States and France, prior to those world wars, but after that, it essentially changed to almost entirely democracies, and the only monarchies left are really just figureheads, like in Great Britain, Spain, and other countries in Europe. So then he goes on to talk about the differences in these governments. Generally speaking, as background information, Hoppe is technically a libertarian. You could also call him an anarcho-capitalist. So he's really not a fan of government in particular. However, he does note that there are differences between these kinds of governments, monarchy and democracy, and that even though he's not a fan of government, he actually prefers monarchy to democracy, which sounds like a bit of an odd claim, but he does go on to clarify and explain why. So, generally speaking, if somebody owns their own private property, they're going to, if they have half a brain, they're going to take care of it, they're going to ensure that they're getting the most out of it. If I have a house, I want to go ahead and take care of that house and maintain that house because it's my property and I want it to stay valuable and useful to me. So the same thing lies with a monarchy. Generally speaking, you can think of it as a privately owned government, is how Hoppe coins it, where the king owns the government, the king owns the land, and that all of the subjects and all of the property within his kingdom, that's his personal private property. So when you think of it that way, the king has incentives, doesn't mean they're always going to do this, but the incentives are in place for the king to have foresight and take good care of his property and actually plan things out, so he doesn't necessarily want to do anything stupid or rash in the present that would hurt his future property value. So he's going to be a little bit more careful and actually have a bit of a lighter touch. Case in point, we actually have more taxes and more regulations and more legislations now with democracy than we ever would have had in the past with different monarchies. Now, talking about democracy then, that is not a privately owned government, it is a publicly owned government. So what that means to say is, whenever anybody comes to power within a democracy, they don't necessarily have the incentives in place within that system to have good foresight and to actually plan things out so that the country ends up becoming more prosperous in the future. Rather, whoever's in charge of a democracy is able to profit from it now, but they're not able to profit from it once they get out of power. So instead, while any government, Hoppe would argue, monarchy or democracy, because they are essentially a monopoly on law and taxation, they're more likely to tax more as much as they possibly can get away with, and also have the law be made into their favor, The king is at least going to be more reserved about that because he's thinking about the future, but with a democracy, the leaders there don't have any such incentive in place. So instead, all they want to do is profit as much as they can in the present, to hell with the future. Which is why you have democracies get into so much debt, inflation, foreign wars, and the like. And that leads us to the third part of the first chapter, the process of decivilization. So Hoppe would argue that civilization advances when people are rewarded by their own efforts to plan ahead and get the fruits of their own labor. But when you have taxation and legislation from governments, be it a monarchy or democracy, but particularly worse with a democracy, the reverse ends up happening, because with especially a democracy, you have redistribution of wealth pretty much all the time in any democracy, and that typically involves giving from the haves to the have-nots, which is essentially rewarding the have-nots and punishing the haves, and all you're doing there is incentivizing, hey, don't actually plan and work hard and try to get a good future for yourself, the government's just going to take it away from you anyways, so it makes people more present-oriented instead of future-oriented, reversing the trend of civilization and therefore causing decivilization. In any case, the second chapter, on monarchy, democracy, and the idea of natural order. So he's going into more depth on monarchy and democracy in terms of the differences there that I've already outlined, and then the idea of natural order, which is his alternative to monarchy and democracy, and really his alternative to government in general, being essentially anarcho-capitalism in terms of just having individual people and groups of people voluntarily cooperating within the confines of consensual contracts and property rights. So then going on to the third chapter on monarchy, democracy, public opinion, and delegitimation. So one thing that he's mentioning here with monarchy and democracy, but especially democracy, is public opinion. At the end of the day, power of government rests on public opinion. A monarchy, a democracy, or even other forms of government, they rest on public opinion. They need the support of the masses in order to conduct any and all actions they do. The reason because of this is simply, if they don't have mass public opinion, you're just going to end up getting a revolt and a revolution, which has happened many times throughout history. So Hoppe's argument for his natural order, as far as how to help carry it out, is to help change public opinion, as well as delegitimize democracy in the view of the public, as monarchy currently is. After all, if you told somebody in public, generally speaking, you walk up to a stranger and say, hey, I actually think monarchy is better than democracy, I think we should have a king instead of a president or a prime minister, most people would laugh at you because they would consider monarchy to be a laughable form of government. They wouldn't consider it legitimate. So Hoppe's idea here is to have democracy made illegitimate in the eyes of the public as well, although he does admit that that's a very difficult notion because, talking about redistribution of wealth, as we already covered, you have people that are poor, people that are impoverished, people that are, say, less intelligent than others, essentially getting subsidized from the opposite. All you're doing is incentivizing degeneracy and decay, and that you end up having a society that's getting worse off, morally speaking and intellectually speaking, and Hoppe even would say genetically speaking in terms of just dysgenics. So then going on to chapter 4, on democracy, redistribution, and destruction of property, he talks about the redistribution of wealth and property. As already stated, he just goes into more detail about it, and the destruction of property, not only in the form of taxation and other forms of expropriation, eminent domain, but also war, in the sense that a monarchy, he does go back to the comparison there, kings fought different wars with each other over different territories, and it was typically a geographic matter, and it was also considered the king's matter, and he was funding the wars with his own wealth. Not to say they didn't go into debt, but certainly less so than now. And the average person in a particular kingdom at that time, they didn't have to have anything to do with the war unless they were a soldier being paid by the king to conduct that war. And likewise, you didn't have the idea of total war that we have now. Generally speaking, an invading party wouldn't hurt civilians. They would generally hold back in that regard because The civilians had nothing to do with it. They didn't have any connection to the king. They just happened to be living there. Meanwhile, with democracy, everybody is funding the government. Everybody, in a sense, is connected and responsible with the government. And we end up having total war now, because not only do the politicians not have to spend their own money on these wars, they can just spend the people's money and go into further debt, inflation, and that sort of thing. But on top of that, they aren't necessarily punished for the crimes that they commit in these wars, and because people are connected to the government in democracy, if you attack the people, you are in essence attacking a supportive element of the government. You're attacking one of the pillars of the government, which wouldn't necessarily be the same thing in a monarchy. So the result is now we have total war, where we have civilians getting harmed in wars all the time. It's completely common, as sad as that is to say. And that would be another example of destruction of property. Chapter 5 is on centralization and secession. So generally speaking, Hoppe argues with any government, you have a natural inclination to centralize, grow, and expand. If I am in charge of the government as a king or as a president, I have a monopoly on taxation and law, and especially how to interpret that law for my own benefit, which Hoppe does get into, talking about courts and the like. I want to get the most out of this system. I want to get the most money and expropriation out of the people as I can get away with, while providing the minimal amount of services, and I also want to grow and expand my tax base. You can do this by immigration, especially almost entirely unlimited immigration, which Hoppe does later argue against, but also in expanding my territory. And while a king wants to expand his own territory for the sake of his own property, it's even worse off with a democracy. And generally speaking, you have governments growing and growing and expanding, sometimes combining with each other. There is a note that would happen more peacefully with monarchies versus democracies, because with monarchies, you can have kingdoms territorially combine with marriages and different treaties and the like, not necessarily with war, but with democracies, it's pretty much always war. And as they grow and expand, they centralize, they get more power, you get economies of scale in this sense, although it's not for the good of the people. And as governments grow and grow and grow, you get international organizations like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and you're moving more and more towards a world government, which is the natural inclination of governments, Hoppe would argue. And secession, he believes, is the primary means in which people can gain back control over their lives and establish a private property anarchy, as he would call it, or anarcho-capitalist society. Chapter 6 is on socialism and desocialization. So he talks about socialism from the extent of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and then talks about how the Eastern European countries, once the Soviet Union fell, desocialized, which on one hand was an improvement, but at the same time they just went into democracies, which then went into all of the problems that he mentions, which in a sense is just one step backward, but still going in the same general direction forwards, as democracies tend to turn into socialist countries. If you really think about the wide variety of government services, taxations, regulations, legislations that democracies have nowadays, it really doesn't seem all that different from socialism. If anything, it's just socialism in disguise. Chapter 7 is on free immigration and forced integration. So here he talks about three primary modes of immigration. You have unconditional immigration, where the government just lets everybody in. Now this can be against the people's will, especially people who own property, and this would be called forced integration, where people are forced to integrate and interact with people that, given the freedom to do so, they would actually choose not to. They would likely trade from a distance, but not necessarily cohabitate. Then there's conditional free immigration, where, hey, we can get rid of the welfare state and different things, and then we can let people in, and they won't be incentivized to just come in to leech off the system. But he still argues this is in violation of people's right to associate or disassociate from people as they wish. Generally speaking, Hoppe spends some time here talking about property rights, and that somebody has the right to associate or discriminate as much as they wish, and that in an anarcho-capitalist society, you would have different groups of people. usually homogenous groups as they tend to stay together, but you would have different people, generally speaking, sticking with their own while trading from a distance with each other. Chapter 8 is on free trade and restricted immigration. That's expanding on the previous chapter, where he mentions how a lot of politicians nowadays seem to be either fans of free trade and unrestricted immigration, or restricted trade and restricted immigration, and he actually argues that in terms of principles of freedom, free trade and restricted immigration is actually the way to go, because that way you're letting people trade freely with one another across borders, while at the same time you're not forcing people to integrate with each other as far as immigration goes. Now, he does say that this is within the context of a democracy. In his anarcho-capitalist society, you would have free trade, generally speaking, as much as people desire to do so, and you would have immigration that would be as free or restricted as each property owner or group of property owners desire. Chapter 9 is on cooperation, tribe, city, and state. This is him more talking about the foundations of human societies, starting from the family and single households to larger groups of kinship, villages, towns, cities, etc. And generally speaking, people stick to their own. However, in cities, there tends to be a bit more diversity in that different people representing merchants from different villages will come up and meet together in order to trade, and generally speaking, you have more mixing within the cities, and then that ends up turning into a government which ends up representing some groups more than others, so then you end up turning into a democracy to represent all the groups equally, quote-unquote. And he's not a fan of equality over freedom. Ahapa would much argue freedom over equality. And then as the cities turn into democracies, then they expand into states and so on and so forth. Chapter 10 on conservatism and libertarianism. So here Hoppe actually argues that conservatism at its core is actually the same as libertarianism at its core, being anarcho-capitalism. So how he gets to that conclusion is that he states conservatives, generally speaking, want to conserve the natural order. That's how he defines a conservative, not just conserving any particular policies at a present time, conserving the status quo, because in that case the definition of conservatives is meaningless. So his definition is based on conserving the natural order, and he would argue the natural order is anarcho-capitalism, and likewise libertarianism, being not a big fan of the state, at its core is also anarcho-capitalism, ergo they're one and the same, and that they need to support each other. He also makes a point that there are, neocons, neoconservatives, who essentially give lip service to conservative social values, but economically are quite socialist in terms of military expansion, welfare state, and the like. And likewise, there are what he calls left libertarians, where people are libertarian in the sense that they're supposedly anti-state and supposedly have anarchy leanings, but at the same time they're fine with laws pertaining to affirmative action and non-discrimination, and really focusing on the freedom of alternative lifestyles such as homosexuality, transsexuality, and the like. And Hoppe argues that the natural state would actually be a socially conservative libertarian, rather than the neocons that are socially conservative and economically left, or left libertarians, which are socially left but economically right. He argues socially right, economically right. Chapter 11 is on the errors of classical liberalism and the future of liberty. He talks here more of classical liberalism from the perspective of the time of the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson, John Locke, that sort of thing. And the primary error he states in classical liberalism is the idea that you have the government in an extremely limited state specifically for the purpose of security, to secure people's property rights and freedoms. And he ends up stating that that's really an error, because in order to have a government, you're having a monopoly on taxation and legislation, which only serves to reduce people's freedoms, and it tends to grow, as we've seen historically speaking. All the democracies have grown. America, Hoppe argues, during its colonial times was very close to anarcho-capitalism, and as it had the War for Independence fought and won against Great Britain, it became this supposedly limited government in the classical liberalist fashion, but it only ended up growing and growing and growing into what we've seen now, which is kind of a joke compared to classical liberalism. So the future of liberty, he says, is to correct this error and disregard the idea of government altogether, and that it's an impossibility to have a limited government only supposedly protecting property. And he also goes on to state, how would they know how much protection to offer? Because generally speaking, in a market, you have supply and demand, and that can determine prices and the quantity of goods as well as their quality. But when you come to a monopoly, how would they know? They aren't necessarily charging people directly, they have taxation, but how do they know how much of their resources to allocate to each individual place and each individual person for their own security? And at the end of the day, the system of a monopoly incentivizes them to minimize the actual security they offer while maximizing the amount that they charge for it. Chapter 12 is on government and the private production of defense. So here he goes into really talking more about his solution of anarcho-capitalism against the form of a government. And the classic question regarding this society is, how do you defend yourself? You know, what's the equivalent of the government having police and judges and law protecting people? So first he would say that modern governments don't actually do that. And secondly, he argues that insurance agencies are actually the solution, and essentially HOAs, or, associations of households. So his idea of an anarcho-capitalist society would be people freely associating with each other, and if they can't necessarily get land or house on their own, somebody might be a landlord owning a bunch of land and houses, and then they can sign a contract with them to get into this HOA of sorts, where now that house is their property, but with certain restrictions to help keep the property values up, which we already have a bit of HOAs now in different parts of the West. But then as defense goes, he argues insurance agencies are the solution, and that they are by default an organization, or a type of organization meant to manage risk effectively for groups of people. So his idea is that you would have competing insurance agencies specifically for security and defense, where somebody would sign up with one of them, and then as part of the contract for signing up with them, they will protect you and help prevent crime and assaults against you and your property, and then in return you're not allowed to assault or be the aggressor against other people's property. And then we'd have competing insurance agencies to decrease the cost of security as they'd be competing with one another. And in the case of different insurance companies against each other, then you would have arbitrators set up ahead of time to mediate between the two of them. And if anybody's not satisfied, well then the arbitrator won't be hired again. The customer may leave that particular insurance company to get a different one, and so on and so forth. And then private ownership of firearms, of course, would be guaranteed in an anarcho-capitalist society, and in fact it would be incentivized, as the insurance companies would likely provide some sort of discount if you own your own weapons and are able to defend yourself to a certain degree. Chapter 13, the last chapter, is on the impossibility of limited government and the prospect for revolution. Here he's talking again about the classical liberalist notion that you can't, or the classic liberalist notion of having a small limited government and how that's actually in error. And as far as the prospect for revolution goes, in terms of how to actually get to his anarcho-capitalist society, he sees the swaying of public opinion within small localities, followed by secession of that locality from the government as the way forward. So he mentions the American Revolution was successful against Britain for two primary reasons. Number one, over on the British side, there was mixed opinions about the American Revolution. There were people over in Britain like Adam Smith that supported them. There were other people that were against it. You had a mixed opinion there, and you had mixed public support against or for the American Revolution over on the British side. And the other side of the coin is that America was or the colonies at the time rather, were very far away physically from Britain, and they were seen as economically insignificant by some of the people over on the British side, so they thought, it's not that big of a deal. So those two things primarily helped, and he argues the war for Southern independence, or the Civil War, failed, not only because the concept of slavery complicated matters, But generally speaking, it was a very large territory, or large group of states within the US seceding that posed an economically significant change for the US. And on top of that, while public opinion was mixed a little bit in the North, he argues there's actually more differences at that time between the North and the South than there was between the colonials and those back in the mainland of Britain. So he argues to avoid the mistakes of the Confederacy and to mirror the success of the American Revolution, small localities, but in great numbers spread throughout the US, should secede. And if they do so, since they're all individually small, they wouldn't be seen as economically significant by the federal government, but if there's enough of them, it would be harder to crack down on, and it would be harder for the US, the American government rather, to change public opinion via propaganda in order to get public support for shutting all of them down. So that's his general idea. I was thinking originally this was going to be 5 to 10 minutes, obviously not the case, mission failed there, but in any case, that's your quick rundown of sorts for the end of 2020. Hope you had a good Christmas, have a happy New Year, see you guys later.